Hello again, everybody. It's been a little while. I'm in Red Rock Canyon in the beautiful Las Vegas Valley. You can kind of see it if I duck my head. Very nice hiking today. Weather's great. Winter time. We are going to talk about the Book of Galatians real quick, an overview. Now, Galatians was a gathering of Jesus liking Gentiles in this area of Galatia. Paul wrote a letter to them because what was happening. Every time Paul writes a letter, there's a bit of a controversy, something going on, something that needs to be tweaked. And in Galatia, what was happening was Paul had gone there, and the Gentiles, non-Hebrew people, were liking this deal of the Yahweh God of Israel, who died on a cross, rose again from the dead, and made everyone free from rules, rituals, superstitions, all of that stuff. Paul's message was that God has done everything for us. God is always for us, always with us, loves us. It's all good news. It's good news. Okay, so now some people in Jerusalem had heard that there were Gentiles that were excited about their Yahweh God. So they went out and thought, well, what we need to do is make these people follow the law system, the law of Moses, that is the tradition of their people with Yahweh. The contract between Israel and Yahweh was the Mosaic law, which included sort of a sign of your membership is circumcision, at least for the men. The women were, you know, sadly, things weren't the 21st century then, so it was the men who made the decisions and whatever. Okay, that sucks. That's wrong. Ultimately, the Bible is not for that. If you read the whole Bible, I think you'll get that. So, okay, so these people were coming and saying you had to follow the law. Now, the law contract between Israel and God was that if Israel did what God told them and obeyed, then God would do good things for them. And if not, there would be bad things that would happen to them. This is a conditional, let's just call it a conditional love relationship. Like, as long as you're doing this, then I'll do my part. That is the old covenant. And in Christianity, as we've talked about, sadly, that gets mixed. So that if you ask anybody on the street what they think Christianity is, then it is that I need to do my part and then God will do his part for me. That is what almost everybody thinks, and it is not what the New Testament or Paul is trying to say. Paul in the New Covenant is unconditional. You can find many verses in the New Testament about the fact that it doesn't matter what our behavior is, what matters is what God did for us. Now, in Galatia, let's get back to Galatians. These people were coming up from Jerusalem to Galatia to tell the Gentiles that they needed to do some rituals of the law or follow the law a little bit or maybe follow the law a lot. It didn't matter. Paul's position is that the law was finished when Jesus rose from the dead. The law was done. Now, what's happening is that these people went to these Gentiles in Galatia, and the Gentile Jesus gathering there was starting to believe it. They were starting to be persuaded that they needed to do things like circumcision or to start following the law. And Paul's, in his mind, he was like, they're going back into the conditional relationship with God, and that is not what Jesus revealed. Jesus revealed an unconditional covenant, an unconditional love relationship with God between humanity and God. This is why Paul is so fired up, because it matters. I think we can see from what I've said so far that how big of a difference there is between an old covenant and the new covenant. Now, Paul spends nearly the entire book of Galatians talking about the law to these Gentile people who don't have a back history of the law or Hebrew history or what we would consider the Old Testament. They don't know all this stuff. They're just being persuaded by these people from Jerusalem, and it's causing confusion. And Paul is acknowledging that. What's confusing you? Something's, these people have come and they've thrown you into confusion. What I told you is that the new covenant is unconditional. He explains all this to them to give them a little bit of a backstory of why the law is no longer to be followed. That is what the book of Galatians is about. So, Paul talks about the history of the Hebrew people a bit, explaining why the law is no longer in effect, why the new covenant is the best thing to follow. And in chapter 5, it's the pinnacle where he says, "It is for freedom that Christ has set us free." Now, he means free from the law. His people have been set free from the law. So he's telling the Gentile people, look at these people that came up from Jerusalem, and you can tell them the meaning of Jesus is that everybody's been set free from the law. Now, the Gentiles were never under the law, but Paul is just saying emphatically, nobody is under the law anymore. That's his statement. He goes on, do not let anybody put you under a yoke of slavery again. Paul considered the law a burden. It was hard. They couldn't follow it. Israel was constantly in trouble because human nature just could not follow the law. The law was a reflection of God's character, and humanity just couldn't live up to it. So Jesus came, forgave everything, and now there is no condition on humanity for God to be in a relationship with us. It's free. God is always for us, etc., etc. What does it mean that it is for freedom that Christ has set us free? It means there's no law, rituals, rules, anything that needs to be done to appease God, to make God happy, so that we grow towards God, so that we become more Christ-like. None of that stuff. It's total freedom. Paul is going to go on to say, if that makes you uncomfortable right now, and it might, Paul is going to go on to say, in your freedom, love each other. You have the freedom to do whatever you want because Christ died and took away the sin of the world. But love each other because in your freedom, you can sit and reflect and realize that that's going to be the best thing, is to care about each other, to not destroy each other. It seems pretty obvious, but in the history of humanity, apparently it's super complicated, and religions have confused it, and superstition has confused everything, and it's a big mess. And Paul is like, we're free now. Now, a lot of pastors will teach this particular freedom part of Galatians and say, well, now God made us free, so now God expects us to be good. That's not freedom, and I'm going to explain to you why. In America, whenever voting comes around once a year, then there's a group of people that always say, you must vote because soldiers died in wars to preserve your freedom, so now you have to go vote. I tell them, if I'm forced to vote, that's not freedom. The freedom that they fought and died for me is so that I can vote or not vote, that I'm not forced to vote. That is what freedom means, and it has to mean the same thing that Paul means, and it is for freedom that Christ has set us free. What God did was, in the Old Testament, the Old Covenant law was rules. God instituted rules and said, live by this, and people couldn't do it. Now we're in freedom. God has decided that there are no rules. So God has entrusted that. Now there's a big learning curve, obviously, because humanity's still a mess. But I believe that the trajectory that God has in mind with this crazy idea is that eventually humans will realize the best thing is to take care of each other and not to rip each other apart. Rules are not going to get us there. That is why Paul is super clear about that the law is no longer in effect. Rules are not going to get us there. It's not going to be a good relationship between God and people, or people between people, with rules and laws. Now, what does that mean for society? I don't know. We need to work that out. I got more comments about that because I've been thinking about it. but it's pretty complex. What I do know is where we're going to start is that Paul said it is for freedom that Christ has set us free, and we're free. And if we go ahead and say that now that we're free, God expects us to be good, it's no longer freedom. So that cannot be the answer to that. It cannot be taught that way. It should not be taught that way. And if you hear it being taught that way, you can tell that person they're not correct. God is gambling that people being set free is going to result in a more harmonious, more loving, more peaceful humanity and relationship with God. That is the gamble. Now, that I think pretty much wraps up Galatians. I think I beat the dead horse. Hopefully it made sense, and we'll talk to you next time.